Audio engineers still cannot explain the stray, mischievous giggle caught on the master tape during this exact broadcast. You're about to see the moment the king of late night stopped being a host and reached out to someone only he could see. For 30 years, the lights of Studio One signaled laughter. Tonight, they felt like a vigil. The air in Burbank usually hummed with electric energy, but on this humid night in June 1991, the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's soul. The producers, men who had built their entire careers on the ironclad schedule of network television, had cornered Johnny in his dressing room just moments before the clock struck 11:30. They were whispering, their voices frantic and hushed, telling him that he didn't have to do this. They told him that the network would understand if the screen stayed dark or if they ran a classic best-of episode. They were terrified that the man who had been the nation's rock was about to shatter in front of 20 million people. But Johnny Carson knew something they didn't. He knew that if he didn't sit in that chair tonight, if he didn't face the lens and the ghosts that haunted him, he might never find the strength to sit in it again. He was a man who lived by the rhythm of the monologue, and that had been violently disrupted. The air in the hallway was so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the shoulders of the camera crew and the musicians, making every breath feel like a chore, an act of defiance against the silence. For 3 decades, this stage had been the heartbeat of America, a place where the cares of the world, from Vietnam to Watergate, were washed away by a clever monologue and a playful, silent wink. But tonight, the heartbeat had slowed to a haunting, rhythmic thud that everyone could feel but no one dared mention. It was a countdown to a moment that promised no punchline. Behind the heavy, deep red velvet curtains, the king of late night was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in the recorded history of the show, the bustling backstage area, usually a hive of writers, guests, and frantic energy, was gripped by a terrifying, absolute silence. We all remember exactly where we were when the news broke about Johnny's boy, Richard. It was the kind of tragedy that doesn't just break a heart. It shatters the very foundation of a man's world, leaving nothing but jagged glass and unanswered questions. Richard was young, full of life, and possessed that same mischievous, intelligent spark in his eyes that had made his father a legend. When he passed away in that terrible accident on a lonely, winding road in California, a part of Johnny ceased to exist right along with him. The public had seen the headlines, sterile and cold, and they had read the carefully drafted statements from the network's PR department. But nobody had seen the father. Nobody had seen the man behind the curtain. And tonight, Johnny had made a demand that sent shockwaves through the corporate offices of NBC. He demanded exactly 12 minutes of uninterrupted, unedited airtime. No commercials, no station breaks, no safety net. It was a massive breach of contract that could, in theory, cost him his career and his legacy. But Johnny was no longer playing by the rules of television. The director in the booth had his finger hovering over the end switch, certain that Johnny was about to say something that could never be taken back. Unaware that these 12 minutes would become the most sacred silence in the history of broadcast media. Inside the dressing room, Johnny sat staring into the mirror. But he wasn't looking at the icon the world knew as the King. He was looking at a man who had lost his compass, a man who felt like a stranger in his own skin. He studied the reflection of his own face, noting the way the heavy stage makeup struggled to fill the hollow, darkened wells beneath his eyes, the physical toll of a grief that had aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. He picked up a small, silver-framed photograph of Richard, taken during a happier summer, and ran his thumb over the glass. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet longing it would have brought a stone to tears. Outside, the audience was being ushered into their seats with a hushed reverence. Their faces were etched with a mixture of anticipation and a deep, gnawing dread. They weren't there for the jokes tonight. This was a reckoning, a moment to see whether the man who had taught them how to laugh could now teach them how to endure the unthinkable. The stage manager checked his watch, his hand trembling as he reached for the headset. The countdown began, not with the usual excitement, but with a somber, ticking precision that felt like a countdown to an ending. Ed McMahon, the man whose voice was usually a joyous roar, didn't say, "Here's Johnny," with his signature gusto. Instead, it was a soft whisper, a jagged, emotional plea to a dear friend that carried the weight of 30 years of brotherhood. It was a call that sounded less like a professional introduction and more like a prayer sent out into the darkness of the wings, hoping for a miracle to emerge from the shadows. When the curtain finally parted, the man who stepped through didn't look like the king of late night. He looked like a father who had been walking through a long, relentless storm. Johnny walked out slowly, his gait lacking its usual rhythmic, confident bounce. As he reached the center of the stage, he stopped short of his traditional mark. He had told the booth to stay on him no matter what happened, and the camera operators felt the sweat on their palms as they realized they were part of a secret plan that had never been rehearsed. Johnny stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, looking out at the sea of faces with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. He looked older, the lines around his mouth were etched deeper by the weeks of mourning, and his signature silver hair seemed a little more fragile under the unforgiving, hot studio lights. He didn't go to the desk to shuffle his papers or check the guest list. He remained standing center stage, anchored by a gravity that seemed to pull at his very soul. His gaze drifted away from the cameras and landed on a specific spot in the front row, a seat that had been reserved for every major taping for as long as anyone could remember. It was Richard's favorite seat, but tonight, the seat was empty. In the center of the cushion sat a single, long-stemmed white rose, its petals pristine and luminous against the dark, worn fabric of the chair. It wasn't the show's florist who had placed that flower there. Johnny had carried it in himself, a secret tribute that held a meaning only two people in the world truly understood, and one of them wasn't there to see it. The audience held its collective breath, watching as the man who had comforted America through every national crisis now struggled to find the strength to comfort himself. He looked at the rose, then back at the people who had invited him into their living rooms for decades, and a small, trembling smile flickered across his lips. It was the look of a man who realized that while he had lost his own flesh and blood, he was standing in a room full of people who were willing to carry a piece of his burden for him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a shared, sacred understanding. Everyone watching knew that the show could not go on as it once had. Stories like this remind us that behind every famous smile is a human heart. If you believe these moments of truth deserve to be remembered, please give this video a like. It helps us tell more stories like this, that the world needs to hear. He reached out a hand toward the audience, not to wave, but as if he were trying to touch the very air between them, seeking a connection that transcended the electronic glow of the television screen. Johnny tried to tell a joke, something about the humidity in Burbank, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. He stood there, the king of the quick wit, but his legendary internal clock had simply stopped ticking. The audience waited for the punchline, for that famous double take, or the smoothing of the tie that signaled everything was all right, but instead, they watched as the very air seemed to leave Johnny's lungs. For 30 years, the monologue had been a sacred contract between Johnny and the American people. But as he looked out at the familiar faces, the rehearsed lines about politicians felt like a betrayal of the heavy, silent truth sitting in the front row. He managed to get out one sentence about the heat, but his voice cracked a fragile, human sound that traveled through 20 million living rooms like a lightning bolt. He took a slow, deliberate step back from the microphone stand. "I can't pretend tonight," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Johnny explained that he had spent hours in his study trying to write something funny, but every time he picked up his pen, he only saw his son's face. He spoke about the passing of his boy, not as a news event, but as a father whose world had suddenly gone quiet. But Johnny hadn't come out here just to grieve. He was about to reveal a side of his life that had been hidden behind the curtain for 30 years, starting with a piece of film that the network didn't even know existed. This was the beginning of the 12 minutes that would redefine a nation's understanding of grief. Johnny sat on the edge of the mahogany desk, letting his legs dangle like a tired man resting after a long journey. He told the viewers at home to put down their snacks, to turn up the volume, and to listen, because he needed to talk to them not as a host, but as a friend who was drowning. He spoke about how we are taught to be strong, to keep moving, and to hide our mourning behind a professional mask. But that tonight, that mask was lying in pieces on the floor of Studio One. It was the most honest moment in the history of television. A man at the height of his power, admitting he was completely powerless against the pain of losing a child. As he spoke, the tension in the room began to transform into something soft and communal. Johnny looked directly into the camera lens, telling the audience that he had something he needed to show them, a mystery he had kept locked away until this very moment. A stagehand began to move toward the center of the floor, carrying a piece of equipment that looked like a relic from a different era. It was an old-fashioned slide projector, smelling faintly of dust and warm light. Johnny looked at the machine with a tenderness usually reserved for an old friend. He stepped down from the riser and sat directly on the edge of the stage, his feet dangling into the darkness. He clicked the remote, and the giant screen flickered to life with the warm, grainy glow of a 35mm slide. The first image was of a young Richard, barely 10 years old, squinting into the sun with a bulky camera draped around his neck. Johnny's voice took on a melodic quality as he began to narrate the private gallery of his heart. Each time the projector clicked, Johnny would pause, letting the dust motes dance in the projector's beam, forcing the audience to sit in the heavy anticipation of the next memory. He was unmasking a Richard the world had never met. He clicked through the images: Richard at a graduation, Richard laughing at a barbecue, Richard staring intently at a California sunset. For each one, Johnny shared a detail that felt like a whispered secret. He told the audience about their very last phone call, just hours before the tragic event, and how Richard had spent 20 minutes describing the way the light was hitting the mountains. He wasn't talking about his son's career. He was talking about his soul. The level of detail was breathtaking, as if Johnny were trying to paint a portrait with his words to ensure that Richard would never truly be gone. He spoke about the way his son would always double-check the focus on his camera, a perfectionist trait he had inherited from his father. The audience sat in a trance, watching the slides click by, the rhythmic sound of the projector acting like a heartbeat for the entire room. As the final slide appeared, a candid shot of Richard looking back over his shoulder and smiling, Johnny's hand began to shake, the remote clicking uselessly. He stared at that smile, that perfect, eternal moment of joy, and prepared to share a vision that had visited him in the deepest part of the night. A dream that felt more real than the stage beneath him. We all have a photograph or a memory that we hold on to when the world gets too quiet. Drop a comment below and share the name of someone you're carrying in your heart today. Let's honor their light together. If I could have one more minute, just one, I wouldn't ask for a laugh or a round of applause. I would ask for the power to reach through the fabric of time and make a single, life-saving correction. Johnny spoke these words with a hollow resonance. He looked out past the stage lights, into the velvet darkness, his eyes seeing a landscape that existed only in the quiet corridors of his own imagination. He began to describe a vision that had come to him in the shivering hours of the morning. A what-if dream so vivid that he had woken up reaching for the telephone. In this dream, the sun was still high over the California coastline, and he arrived on that winding road 5 minutes earlier. He saw Richard's car pulled over by the side of the road, the boy standing there with his camera, trying to capture the golden hour. Johnny pulled over and stepped out into the warm breeze. He described the texture of Richard's jacket, the way the wind ruffled his son's hair, and the look of pure surprise on the boy's face. They didn't talk about show business. They simply stood there, side by side, watching the tide come in. Johnny told the audience that in this dream, he put his arm around Richard's shoulders and whispered 5 words that he wished he had said more often. "I am so proud of you." The imagery was so raw that even the stagehands stood frozen in the wings. Johnny was painting a picture of a world where tragedy was averted by the simple act of being present. He spoke about how we all live with these ghosts of what might have been, the silent movies we play in our heads where the heartbreak never occurs. He was giving voice to the universal cry of every parent who has ever lost a piece of their heart. As the final light from the projector cut out, Johnny reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, an envelope sent by a mother named Mary from Ohio. Johnny had received thousands of letters that week, but this one, crumpled and tear-stained, marked by years of coffee stains and the trembling ink of a broken hand, was the only one he brought onto the stage. It contained a single sentence that had saved his life the night before, and he was about to read it to 20 million people. Johnny told the audience that the words in this envelope would later be engraved on his heart. He told the viewers that this letter had arrived at his home during his darkest hour and had acted like a lighthouse beam. Mary wrote that she had felt ashamed to grieve out loud because she felt the world only stopped for the famous and the powerful. Johnny shook his head slowly, telling her and the 20 million people watching that there is no hierarchy in mourning. He explained that the pain of a mother in Ohio is identical to the pain of a man in Malibu. He read a passage where Mary described her son's favorite baseball cap, still sitting on the hook by the door, and how she couldn't bring herself to move it because it still held the scent of the outdoors. Johnny's voice broke as he admitted that he, too, had a jacket of Richard's that he carried from room to room like a sacred relic. This was the moment the what-if storytelling became a bridge of shared humanity. Johnny was telling every viewer who had ever felt invisible in their sorrow that they were seen. He was turning a late-night talk show into a sanctuary for the brokenhearted. The power of his words was transformative. He spoke about how we often feel we must suffer in silence to avoid making others uncomfortable, but that tonight, he was giving everyone permission to scream into the wind. He told Mary that her son mattered just as much as his own, and that their shared grief had made them family. As he folded the letter and tucked it back against his heart, a strange, expectant energy began to settle over the stage. Grief can be a lonely road, but tonight Johnny reminded us that no one has to walk it alone. Before we reveal the mystery that engineers still can't explain, please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their story and their loss truly matters. Suddenly, the temperature on the stage seemed to drop, and the floor manager, a man who had seen 4 presidents on this stage, dropped his clipboard, staring not at the monitor but at the empty chair. A gentle, impossible breeze swept through the soundproofed studio. It was a physical sensation that defied logic, a soft stirring of the air that made the heavy velvet curtains ripple. Johnny stopped mid-sentence, his head tilting toward the wings where the shadows felt alive. The audience noticed it too. A collective shiver ran through the rows of seats as the studio lights flickered once, twice. Not with the harsh snap of a power surge, but with the soft, pulsing rhythm of a distant heartbeat. Johnny looked toward the front row, toward that empty chair where the single white rose sat. In that moment, a miracle of light occurred. A stray beam from the overhead rafters, unguided by any technician, slanted down and illuminated the flower, making it glow with a brilliance that seemed to come from within. The rose didn't just sit there, it seemed to lean, its stem bowing slightly as if under the weight of an invisible hand. Johnny's face transformed, the mask of the entertainer dissolving into the raw, wonder-filled expression of a child. He took a staggering step toward the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on the empty space beside the rose. We watched as the king of late night reached out his hand, his fingers splaying in the air as if he were ruffling the hair of someone only he could see. The boom operator, a 20-year veteran named Frank, would later swear that he heard a faint, mischievous giggle, the specific laugh of a young man who loved a good joke, drifting through his headset. To this day, the audio engineers cannot explain how that sound ended up on the master tape. It shouldn't have been possible. But as Johnny reached out into the empty air, it became clear to everyone in the room that the cameras were capturing something from the other side. Johnny stood there in that pool of impossible light, his tears finally flowing freely. But they weren't tears of anguish, they were tears of recognition. He was telling us that the lost are never truly gone, that they linger in the spaces between our heartbeats. Johnny turned back to the lens of camera 1, his eyes shining with a clarity we had never seen in 30 years of broadcasting. He realized that the lesson he was about to share wasn't about the ending of a life, but about the endurance of a soul. Grief isn't a wall that stands between us and the light, Johnny told the people watching. It is a bridge we all eventually have to walk. He sat there, his hands resting on his knees, no longer the untouchable titan of industry but a fellow traveler. He spoke directly to the generation that had grown gray alongside him, the parents who understood the jagged, unfair reality of outliving one's own flesh and blood. He admitted that he had stayed away for those long weeks, not because he was angry, but because he was terrified that the glare would reveal that he was empty. But then, he shared the secret lesson he had learned in the silence. He realized that the world doesn't need us to be perfect. It needs us to be honest. He explained that by sharing his sorrow so publicly, he wasn't just healing himself. He was giving a voice to every silent mourner in America. He spoke about the sacred duty of those who are left behind to carry the light, for those who have departed, to live twice as vividly to make up for the years their loved ones were denied. This was the heartbeat moment of the night, where the pain of a single father became a universal balm. He spoke about the white rose on the chair not as a symbol of an ending, but as a reminder that beauty remains, even when the gardener is gone. He told the audience that it was okay to be sad, but it was never okay to give up on the joy that our children would want us to feel. The air in the studio felt lighter now, replaced by a soft, glowing catharsis. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by a soft amber light, and checked the clock on the wall, realizing that the most difficult 12 minutes of his career were drawing to a close. The 12 minutes were almost up, and in the control room, the producers were frantically signaling for a commercial, their hands cutting through the air. But Johnny ignored them entirely. He sat there, anchored to the edge of that stage, a man who now found himself answerable only to the beating of his own heart. The countdown on the monitors continued to blink in a harsh, neon red. Yet, the king of late night didn't move a muscle. His focus locked onto the lens of the camera. He reached the climax of his emotion, his voice thickening with a resonance that felt like it was being pulled from the very depths of the earth. He thanked the audience for raising his boys, telling them that they had been the silent partners in his fatherhood for 30 years. Then, the legendary Carson composure finally and completely shattered. Johnny bowed his head, his shoulders heaving as he finally let go of the weight he had been carrying. He didn't turn away from the camera. He let the nation see the tears. Let them hear the ragged, honest sound of a man mourning the most precious thing he had ever known. The audience slowly, one by one, began to stand. The sound of their rising bodies creating a soft, rustling wave of support that seemed to lift Johnny back onto his feet. Ed McMahon was weeping openly at his desk, his large frame shaking with the effort of his own grief. And even the hardened security guards were wiping their eyes. In those final 60 seconds, Johnny looked up, his face wet and glistening, and he gave a small, shaky thumbs up to the empty chair in the front row. He was telling Richard and the world that he was going to be all right, not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally found a way to share it with the people who loved him. As the theme music finally began to swell, a somber version of the tune we all knew so well, Johnny walked slowly back to his desk, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He had given us everything he had left. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, the single white rose remained on that empty chair, a silent witness to the 12 minutes that changed everything. The studio was plunged into a soft, blue twilight as the crew moved like ghosts, whispering in hushed tones as if they were standing on hallowed ground. Johnny didn't rush to his car or hide in his dressing room. Instead, he stayed on the stage until the very last light was dimmed. He sat back down in his mahogany chair, looking out at the rows of empty seats, realizing that he had just performed the most important monologue of his life. He had walked onto that stage as an icon, but he was leaving it as a human being who had found the strength to carry his sorrow into the light. In the hours after the broadcast, something unusual happened across the country. Phones rang between people who hadn't spoken in years. Parents checked on sleeping children, standing quietly in doorways, watching chests rise and fall, counting breaths they had once taken for granted. Some viewers sat alone in the dark long after the credits ended, the television still glowing, replaying Johnny's words in their minds because they sounded painfully familiar. It didn't feel like a television moment, it felt like a shared experience. Johnny hadn't offered answers. He hadn't wrapped grief in optimism or softened it with humor. He simply stood inside the pain and refused to look away, allowing the silence to do what jokes never could. In doing so, he reminded people that loss isn't something you solve, it's something you learn to carry. Day by day, breath by breath. And for the first time, many realized they weren't carrying it alone. That night didn't heal the wound. It gave it air. In the years that followed, that night in June 1991 became a touchstone for millions of Americans who were navigating their own dark valleys of mourning. People began to write to the show, not with jokes, but with stories of their own white roses, the ways they were keeping the memories of their lost children alive. Johnny read every single one of them. He never spoke of that night again on the air, but his eyes held a different kind of sparkle from then on. a depth of compassion that hadn't been there before. He had learned that when we share our heartbreak, we multiply the love. The white rose was eventually taken home by Johnny, where he pressed it into a book of Richard's photography, a permanent marker for a chapter of life as beautiful as it was brief. He had proven to a nation that it was possible to survive the unthinkable, and that even when the laughter stops, the love remains. Success, he realized, was a hollow prize if you had no one to share it with, but legacy was the warmth you left behind in the hearts of others. As he finally walked out of the studio doors for the last time years later, he touched his hand to his heart, knowing that he had kept his promise to his son. The story of the 12 minutes reminds us that we are all just fragile souls hoping someone notices when our light begins to flicker. It tells us that no matter how famous or forgotten we may feel, our grief is sacred, and our love is eternal. If you felt the power of Johnny's tribute, please hit the like button to honor the memories of those we've lost. Subscribe to join our family as we uncover the most touching, hidden moments behind Hollywood's greatest legends, and ring the bell so you never miss a story that speaks to the heart.